Okay, so I'm Cameron Shorter. I'm a technical writer, and I currently work at Google. But what I'm really talking about here is what we've been doing in the open source community, and in particular the GoodDocs project as part of this. So, and this, one of the great things about open source that I've found that really keeps me coming back, and why I've stuck around for so long, is that I see it as a huge social success story. It's one of the things that I love about it, and it's creating huge technical value and value for the whole community, which we share with the entire community. And I love that. But one of the things that keeps on coming back in surveys from the open source community, and now I'm also seeing in surveys that I've seen in proprietary company surveys as well, is that incomplete and outdated documentation is a pervasive problem suffered by most of these projects. So what are we going to do about that? A bunch of us tech writers have gathered together under the banner of the GoodDocs project. And what we want to do is sort of tackle these challenges. Our initial focus was on open source and open source documentation, but we've kind of realized that these patterns and anti-patterns keep repeating themselves across all sorts of domains. It's I like to think of it like a formula for a movie. You know, the characters keep changing, but the plot keeps on staying the same. So if we can sort of address these systemic writing challenges that we all have, I'm hoping that we can lift the entire tech writing ecosystem and the projects that depend upon us as part of that. And so from looking around and looking deep inside these projects and looking at some of the research that's out there, we've kind of found these pockets of awesomeness. It's spread across presentations, across blog posts, across forums, across applications, and there's some organization-specific practices, but there's also holes in this as well. And one of the challenging parts is actually working out what's awesome and what's not. So we started building templates and writing instructions, and then sort of describing the patterns that we can build and the roadmap of how we can sort of move forward. So I guess probably one of the key points is, why should we focus on patterns and describing these patterns? And I see it as being really important to describe these patterns, because it helps us recognize that these problems are universal, that all of our organizations are all facing them. And if they're universal, then they can be solved collaboratively, and we can each of us pick up a little section of this problem. And one of the really beautiful things about it is these problems are actually relatively independent. And so, you know, I can go in and start focusing on the template structure, and you could go and start focusing on what wiki format we decide to solve it, like put that structure into. These are two separate problems, and we can come together and have the same vision, but come back to the same, like work on it locally in our own little areas. So I thought I'd do a bit of a context switch slightly here and start digging into these patterns. And one of the patterns that we can pull out of the open source community is that collaboration often outcompetes competition. Basically, in a digital economy, collaborative communities are outcompeting these closed and centrally controlled initiatives. Not always. Actually, in most cases, the projects fail, and there's some really good research that sort of looks into this and finds the success factors of what makes it work. But we can say that collaboration found in these open source communities offers a really compelling alternative to capitalism, and I think is something that we should be adopting and spearheading in our community, in our tech writing community. So if we sort of get the idea of this, in capitalism, you pitch an idea, you raise capital, you hire staff, you build a product, you sell it. And with open source, it's pretty much the same, but you know, the emphasis is in a slightly different places. We paint a vision, you know, like a really, really compelling, awesome vision. And then you go in and you attract collaborators who just are compelled, say, hey, this is really cool. If we could solve this together, let's get on board. And I could do a bit of that. Then we go and build it, then we go and share it with everybody, and we all collectively lift up the capability of not just ourselves, but all the people around us as well. It sounds kind of cool, doesn't it? So, and there's multiple aspects to this collaboration. So when we were going in and researching the tech writing domain, and I was looking at some of these projects, I very quickly came to the realization that it's pretty easy to write reasonable documentation, but it's hard to write excellent documentation. And part of the reason behind that is that there's no one person who's good at writing excellent documentation. We're actually drawing down upon the software developer who wrote it, the end user who has the expertise and knows what the whole domain is about and can describe what you're actually trying to achieve. You've got educators who know like learning theory and work out how to inspire people to absorb this information. Then you've got the information architecture who pulls all sorts together. And of course, us writers who go in and collate this information and get the grammar right and the structure and pull all these ideas together nicely. Translators, of course, who go and translate it from one language to another. And all this requires quite a bit of coordination, and you have a coordinator for that role and a DevOps person who's handling all the infrastructure to make all the publishing pipeline work. So we want to try and pull all of these people together, and that's what we're trying to do and explain and bring like a central role around all of it. Now, one of the anti-patterns that we have in our industry is that because these documentations are so easy to write, and it's easy to write poor documentation, it's actually kind of hard to recognize what good documents are. And I think it's really important to help people realize why it's worth investing in documentation. So there's this really low barrier to entry to writing tick box acceptable documentation. However, there's a very high collaborative overhead associated with writing excellent documentation. And we're actually finding it really hard to measure, explain, and justify the value of this good documentation. And I think one of the key reasons why this is the case is that us tech writers are very often we have very low political capital inside the organizations we're in. We're often just like a singleton tech writer. We're out there. We've got no organization backing us. We haven't got the head of the organization knowing what it is we actually do, what value we add as tech writers. And so what I'm really hoping we can achieve here is we can collate these best practices and be able to refer back to them and say, hey, I'm a tech writer and I'm doing this because I'm actually spending the extra effort on your architecture because this is best practices. And all of these tech writers behind us, this GoodDocs project that we're all working with, we all agree on this. And if you don't agree with it, you're breaking with best practices. So, sort of brings us into templates. Templates, everyone's got templates. Every organization you go into has got templates. But what are good templates? The same thing as what's good documentation. And there's quite a bit of theory that's sort of coming into here. They're saying there's actually multiple types of templates and multiple documentation types. And each documentation type has a different need for the for documentation. So our API reference guides, they need to be up to date with the latest software. But it doesn't really matter if the description of it is using sloppy English. It doesn't have to have perfect punctuation, but it does need to be accurate and unambiguous. Our tutorials, on the other hand, who cares if it's an old version of the software that you're actually explaining? All you're really after is the general concept of the product that you have, and you're introducing people in gradually, bit by bit. But it does need to be good quality. It does need to be written, and we need to be really careful that people don't accidentally fall off the sides So quality is much more important with regards to the level of writing that we have there. And one of the ways I like describing templates is I see it as like a conduit for collaboration. It allows us to take ideas and be able to facilitate moving these ideas through time, through projects, through different roles, through different job types. And it enables us to provide significant efficiencies by allowing the experts to focus on the bits that they do best. And the flow that we go through when we're doing this is that you'll tend to have your experts, your learning experts, your tech writing experts go and embed their knowledge into the template. Then you can go and have your engineers go and write against this template and write the contents down. And then our writers can come back afterwards and polish it up against the template and improve it and get it refined and get some really good quality documentation coming out the other end. There's probably a few more variants on that, but that's the rough idea of it. So when we're when we were assessing how to help with the docs in the open source projects, we discovered that we actually didn't really have a good definition of what is good documentation. So we were looking for language to be able to explain the different levels of quality so that we could then go through and prioritize to our managers and say, hey, our docs are really bad and it's only at a level 3 or a level 2 or whatever it is. And we really want to be at a level 5. Where's that language? How do we describe that? And where are the measures that we can use to describe that? And then once you've got that language in place and those measures in place, we can then go through and prioritize and help management focus on our documentation. And in order to be able to get there, what we've done is we've gone and set up defined a project for a docs audit checklist, where we can go in and set the criteria that we want for the different doc types. And so this is something we're wanting to focus on this year, and hopefully we'll have something together by the end of the year. So an anti-pattern I'm sure most of you will be very familiar with this. An anti-pattern that we have is outdated documentation. Our docs are technical debt. And so we should try and own as little of that as possible. And that effectively means, we should try and get the best products. I mean, well, firstly, our best products should be so intuitive that they don't need documentation. Ideal scenario. We won't necessarily quite get there the majority of the time. But one of the things we can do is we can actually go in and remove content from our documentation. After a while, you get to a point where you've got quite a bit of documentation. And so you want to try, if you can actually go through and prune it and get rid of stuff, that will really make things easier for maintenance long term. That's actually a lot easier to say than do. Going and removing documentation actually requires you to understand what is that this documentation depends upon. It's actually really quite a tough ask. It's a lot easier to add documentation than to take it away. The other thing we could do is write concisely, and that's what us tech writers are. That's our bread and butter, being able to help people write clearly, concisely, less words, and then the whole pipeline following behind it becomes easier to maintain. The old adage behind this is less words, get read more. So if we, the other thing we can do is we can actually go in and instead of writing content ourselves, we can potentially just go out and reference something that's already out there. So let's not just go and write another how to use Git tutorial. There's plenty out there. Use theirs instead, and then you'll be able to keep your own docs set nice and tight and lift the quality of your own docs instead. Then you can go one step further and say, hey, how about if we're using external content, how about we even see that external content? Maybe we can release our documentation as open source documentation ourselves. Usually our docs are not actually what it is that is our selling point for our product. A documentation is sort of like the internet. It's just a given. You need to have it. You can have poor internet and your website's slow and people will leave. Same with documentation. Poor documentation, people will go. But it's not actually your defining point. And if you actually push it out into the community and work with the community to maintain it, that is actually a really valuable way of moving forward. The other thing you can do is embed documentation checklists into your build cycle. So if you can actually go in and say your software won't be released unless it has all the documentation in place and up to date and current and reviewed, then that hopefully should lift up the game of your documentation. And then there's a whole bunch of freshness monitoring processes which I've seen put in place. And these are sorts of things where you go and we'll have a process where people check in on documentation that they're responsible for and say, hey, every 6 months, I'll review my docs and see if they're still current. And a version of this is actually saying, well, one way to try and make sure your docs stay current is to write timeless material as much as you can. And when I say timeless material, what I'm referring about is wherever you go and say the latest version of my software, when you're using the latest version of my software, do such and such, or look at the new user interface for this thing, because the new user interface won't be new in 12 months' time. And you're guaranteeing that you're going to have to go and update that documentation. So try and write words around release 5.2 as opposed to the new release. Okay, another anti-pattern that I suspect most of you are familiar with. I've found that many users in the communities that I work in, especially the open source communities that I've been working with, that there's a whole bunch of users out there who are so thankful for the open source documentation they've got and the quality of it, and they see all these people giving and all these developers giving work for free, and they say, how can I help? I'd love to do something. I'm not technical. I could write your docs for you if you like. I know that stuff. And then they go in and they get completely stumped by the fact that we're using Git and we're using Markdown and they're lost and we lose them. And this sort of aligns with some research that I recently saw from Tom Johnson, who's one of the leading tech writers and thought leaders in this area. And he interviewed 400 plus tech writers and found that most tech writers tend to start writing in Google Docs or in a WYSIWYG editor like Google Docs or Microsoft Word. And then once they've got it to a certain level of quality and they've gone through the process of getting these track changes and reviews and comments sorted out, then they switch across to using Git and Markdown, which is in line with the releasing processes that work with, like the continuous integration type processes that are in place. And we as tech writers are suffering because of this. We really want to get the best of the Google Docs type experience of reviews and quick turnarounds and the syntax highlighting and grammar checking and all those other beautiful things. But then we also want to be able to have the power of these tools that come with the Git-based tool chains. And it's quite messy in the process converting between these two. And I believe that we are losing a lot of potential and a lot of time because of this, and especially if you multiply it across all the people who are suffering. And I would just love it if someone could step up and take this problem and focus on it. I don't think it'd be too hard to get a Google Docs which backs into a Git backend or something similar to that, And it would be non-trivial, but considering the size of the problem, this is something that we really should be investing in. Talk to me if you address it, please. The other one you're all probably quite familiar with is style guides. There's tons of them out there. Which one do you want? We all sort of should have one of these in place that makes our docs look a lot more professional. And what you want to be able to do is go and pick one and then probably go in and customize it and improve it. And one of the things that recently Alicia Rock, who's in the GoodDocs project, has been tackling is writing best practices around customizing a style guide and selecting one, and how you go and extend it for your project. And sort of building up from style guides is going in and selecting glossaries associated with that style guide, your preferred word list, how you spell things, your preferred terms. And building a glossary is actually pretty easy to do when there's, you just got one document, you just search through it, you find the words you use and create a table at the end. But it becomes a nightmare when you start to build out these terms and start thinking about it outside of your project, outside of your organization, and start trying to pull in terms and then maintain consistent terms between different organizations. And so we've kicked off a project between a bunch of people in the standards community, open source communities, the tech writing communities, and of course the open source communities, to try and work on this. And if you want to get involved on this, this is like a really hard problem, but we've got some really deep experts on this, and I'm expecting we'll get some interesting results at the end of this, some very workable things to work from by the end of this period in December or so. And then there's content reuse, and there's actually the concept of glossaries is actually one of these variants, because what we're doing is we're reusing content from another organization, we're reusing their glossaries. It's the concept of inheritance. But then you've also got variable substitution and section substitution, which is sort of where you can go in and create a cookbook of, I want to get this section from here, that section from over there, and pull it all together and make it sort of like that diagram I've got there. Traceability is another challenging thing. Quite often, this is usually something that fits into the engineering space and has this whole new set of rules with regards to writing good requirements. It's really important in very large programs where no one person can have their head around everything. I've worked in large shipbuilding and helicopter building type programs where the amount of information being shared is important, and quality is hugely important. And you want to be able to go in and say, here are my list of requirements, and I want to guarantee that all the requirements have been tested by somebody, and you can line up the requirements, and then line up the test pan, and then line up the test results, and trace from one to the other, and get this traceability happening. And then localization and accessibility. This is another really important thing for us to be aware of and work out. And there's a whole set of tooling processes, doc structures that we should be focusing on, and I'd love to be able to be capturing into our recommendations. And the bonus of getting this right is that you really open up your community of people you can talk to. And then we've got the, this is something I've picked up from Riona McNamara, and I'll quote from the larger statement that she made. Vibrant communities are critical for project health, code quality, and adoption, but lack of clear documentation about our project, its code, its norms and processes, and our community is a highly effective barrier to adoption and to contribution. So if we do what we can to make sure that knowledge is accessible to everyone, regardless of their disability or language or social capital, then we promote equality. Knowledge is power, documentation puts that in the hands of the people. So that's effectively where I'm going to leave it and say, are you inspired? Does this interest you? Do any of these ideas help you? We're starting to tackle these problems in the GoodDocs project. There's some stuff there that you can already make use of, but mostly it's a case of, hey, come back, watch the space, or come in and help us do it. Come and join the GoodDocs project. Go to the community and the sign-up page and join our email list, and I'll reach out to me personally, and I'll help you on your journey. That's it. Over to you, Swapnil.
Thanks, Cameron. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Cameron directly. We've got some time, so perfectly okay for him to answer questions if anyone's got any.
Nobody?
Hey, Cameron.
I was just going to say, it's David here from.
I think two people spoke. I'll hand over to David. Do you want to speak, David?
I was just going to say, I didn't have a question, but I just thought I love the idea, and repeatable patterns. You see it again and again, don't you? That if people just followed some basics, they'd get a really good product. But they reinvent everything from scratch again. So yeah, no, that's great, and I'll have a look at that. I'll have a look at the project, and I think that's really
wonderful.
cool.
I'll look out for you, David. I think you're dead right. I'm not actually explaining anything here. I think most of you would recognize just about everything I'm seeing here. And what I think is really important for us is to actually bring it up and expose it at a level where we can actually do something about it. And I believe we can collectively do something about it by stepping up and each of us tackling a little part of this problem, but doing it with each other so that we can help each other collectively push this message forward. We are the tech writers, we're the experts. And collectively, if we get our voices added together, we can start pushing it up through our management chains. Sarah.
Hey, hi, Cameron, thanks. So I'm really interested in, right at the beginning, you said something like, you compared capitalism to open source. And you said something like, in open source, you basically build the vision and make it really inspiring, and then the people come. So I was just wondering, as the person who is the kind of visionary leader of an open source project, how much work would you say you yourself have to do in terms of practically getting things done? And how much do you think you can leave up to the community?
There's multiple parts to this answer. There are more people in the rest of the world trying to solve this collective problem than I'm ever going to have in my own team. And I'm in a team, and I have all of these problems. And what I have to confess, I'm probably spending 60 hours a week so I'm probably spending about 40 hours a week on my day job, and then 20 hours a week in my spare time, just working on this, trying to get the idea off the ground and get it working. But I find it so incredibly rewarding, because what you find is lots of people out there say, oh, I've so wanted to solve this problem, and so willing and helpful, and I feel incredibly inspired by all the people around me who are doing these things, and by having a project like this, it enables us to give a voice to all these people who are doing things. So yeah, it's quite a bit of effort from a coordination point of view, but the return on investment, I believe, is absolutely huge. I'd like to actually, I'm decided I'm going to coin a new term. I think it's sort of a case of inspiring or finding the rough diamonds in open source communities, and then helping them grow and cultivating them. That I feel is I mean, what people like you are. It's just ordinary people who have just doing a little bit of extra work, do something kind of extraordinary. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. That's a lovely, inspiring answer.
Cameron, it's Stephen Gates here. It's Stephen Gates here. I was just interested in what the output of the project would be. Like, you've spent a lot of time talking about patterns, and so I was wondering whether the final result of the project is a collection of patterns guiding people about how to do things, or whether it's actually a template document site.
Yeah, so this slide deck is basically a summary of a large essay I've written. And in that essay, or effectively each one of these slides corresponds to a project. And out of that project, there will be probably a number of deliverables. So out of the templates slide, I am anticipating that we will get we have a concept of pulling in a bunch of templates for the key use cases, and I see there being a number of templates and writing instructions for each of those. I think it's probably going to be about 7 or so core templates, and then a base template. And I wanted to call it a template of templates. Basically, how do you write a template? Because there's a whole lot of variance on and use cases for all of these different templates. And there's probably 100 or so templates that are out there for all the different niches. And so I see us going in and beyond just writing for your organization. If you're doing it for your organization, why don't you go one step further and share it into this community? Get feedback from all the other tech writers who are helping you and improve it. And then it's out there in the community. So you can use it, other people can use it, and it's there. I could keep on rattling on about all the different deliverables, but there's probably about 100 of them.
Thank you.
Hi, Cameron. This is Gauri. I have a question on, the number of hours of commitment that, writers who are participating in the GoodDocs project. I know it could be a vague question because I'm sure it depends on a lot of factors, but typically in a week, what's the kind of, the time commitment that you think is required?
It's one of those open-ended things. I guess the real question is, can you produce more quality for the people around you than those people who are mentoring you to get into the project? And I would anticipate in the order, you probably have an hour a week with regards to just keeping up to date with the emails and the chats and the weekly meeting type things. And then on top of that, you would probably want to spend another, I don't know, maybe 4 hours a week focusing on the little niche that you decide to bite off. And if you want to take on more than that, then even better. Ideally, if you can line it up with something you're doing at work, that's where the real return on investment happens for both you and the project.
Right. Got it. That's helpful. Thanks, Cameron.
Anyone else?